This is absolutely frightening. Two teenage boys allegedly broke into a home in Alice Springs and they struck a woman with a detachable metal freezer handle. They hit her so hard that it rebounded, hitting a 2-month-old baby and causing the baby a fractured skull and a brain bleed. And it turns out that these blokes had been collectively charged with almost 300 other offences and bailed 35 times and were currently on bail. Goodness me, we're not doing good enough. Senator Kerryn Little is the Shadow Minister for Child Protection and the Prevention of Family Violence and joins us now. Kerryn, this is absolute. Well, I mean, what happens in Alice Springs on a regular basis is a tragedy, but this is extraordinary.
Yeah, well, I think we should all note that Territorians in Central Australia are living with this sort of stuff just about every day. They expect to wake up and go to sleep, not knowing whether it's going to be a safe night or a safe day for them. And this is just outrageous that, you know, the Albanese Government invested $300 million into Central Australia, and what we've actually seen is outcomes for locals going in the wrong direction. You mentioned about the recidivism rate of those individuals. I mean, seriously, not only the number of charges is eyebrow-raising, but the number of breaches of those charges and still out on bail is extraordinary. Why is anybody thinking that these events were not predictable?
The problem, Senator, that I see is in your portfolio, we always talk about how do we lower the scourge of domestic violence and family violence, and we often talk about creating services for women to escape the situation they're in, or creating, usually focusing after the event. Sometimes it can be as simple as making sure that our bail laws are right.
Well, that's true, and the coroner made some really interesting findings that I spoke to you about a couple of weeks ago, and a lot of that was on how do you actually change the behaviour of people early. But, you know, what I'm focused too on changing the behaviour of people before it escalates to a point where it's so bad that other people and themselves are at risk. There is definitely a connection between violence and crime, because we see children who are not safe at home because it's unbearably unsafe to be there, but it is inexcusable to then take that and make it unbearably unsafe for other people. So I hear this week that the minister in the Northern Territory is talking about, this is the federal minister, is talking about, you know, talking to the Aboriginal engagement group that they've put together, where I say, talk to everyone, don't just talk to that group, because they've been the people that have been providing the advice on how to spend that $300 million. We keep asking and screaming for an audit of some of those organisations whose performance is already questionable, and yet they're getting money for such a critical piece of work to keep Central Australians safe. You know, the government made a promise of frontline service workers, and we still only have around 7.6 equivalent workers in the Northern Territory, even though the commitment at the election was that they would have 20. So we've seen the rapid review response and the recommendations come out. We've been told, though, that there won't be any money until after the 1st of July. And yet the coroner has been saying in her report the need is urgent and it's right now. But she's also talking about the accountability of service providers to make sure that the programs that are delivered to make change actually do that. It is no good to continue funding these organisations that put out glossy brochures that tell you how wonderful they are without independently evaluating what they are actually doing, what they are achieving, and that's incumbent on the Albanese Government to do that, because otherwise what you see is $300 million spent, and yet the rate of crime and the unsafe conditions for people continue to go in the opposite direction.
And particularly in a jurisdiction like the Northern Territory, where you've got a fairly small government and a fairly small police force in general terms, it puts too much pressure back on them. But I will give a shout out to Leah Finocchiaro, the Chief Minister in the Territory, who jumped on a plane straight away and got down to Alice Springs straight after this happened, in stark contrast to the Prime Minister addressing issues more nationally.
Well, we did see our Prime Minister go in on a Monday when there are no takeaway alcohol sales. So he timed that very well to make sure that he could drive around without the harassment that locals deal with often. The terrible thing about what's happening here is it has an impact in the cost of living crisis. The amount of money that locals spend on security, we saw people putting up additional barbed wire. I mean, how ridiculous is it that people are thinking that they're going to have to take those kinds of steps to keep themselves how they feel safe. They're not necessarily safer. I think Territorians really need to ask themselves, are they actually better off and safer than when the Prime Minister determined that he needed to put $300 million into Central Australia and when they were elected? And the answer to that is no. So accountability is key in this. The Commonwealth has a role to play in this, and the Commonwealth has a role to also play in not just making this a problem for the Aboriginal leadership group to solve. This needs to include community clubs, businesses, residents, and they need to drag, kicking and screaming, those organisations that were funded under this $300 million to say, well, what are you doing? And ask other organisations, what are you doing to prepare, or what did you do to prepare for this? Because locals actually know, and I talk to locals often. I've got lots of family there. That's where I was born and raised. Locals know that things are about to get much worse.
Authorised by Karen Little, Liberal Party, Adelaide.